So Janice and I first met here. Actually, I shouldn't say that. We met years ago. Her son went to Horace Mann, and I was his librarian. And we discovered that when I first started working here. And she's like, "You're not going to remember my son. He graduated in like 2004." And I was like, "Dark hair, kind of curly, played soccer." And she was like, "Yes." So Janice has done it all. She's been a journalist. She was editor-in-chief of Parade magazine, which was the largest magazine in America at the time. She was a former producer at Good Morning America. She hosted a daily podcast. I'm like, when do you have time to write and sleep and all the other things? And she also writes New York Times bestsellers like the Gratitude Diaries. And this book was sure to be a bestseller, What Your Body Knows About Happiness. Jean Korelitz is the best-selling author of 9 novels, 2 of which we have here in the library, the sequel and the plot. She also, some of her stuff has been, her books have been adapted into for the screen, The Undoing on HBO, Admission on HBO starring Tina Fey. She's a graduate at Dartmouth, which is that great moment when the Dartmouth and Yale parts of this club come together on the stage. And she hosts book groups with well-known writers. And we are just delighted to have the 2 of them here tonight talking about Janice's book, What Your Body Knows About Happiness. And you will notice when you came in, we have copies for sale. If you fill out the form and just put your member number on there, we'll just charge it to your member account. If you took a book and you didn't fill out the form, I'd love you to do that, because at the end, it never matches up, and then the library just eats that cost. So welcome to both of you.
So I promised to let Jean lead the discussion, but I did just want to start by saying that I wrote most of this book in this library, and working with Caroline Bartles is just such a joy. I was always in the position of, working for 3 hours to try to find a piece of research that I couldn't find, and then going to her and saying, "Do you think you could possibly find for me?" And 4 minutes later, she was handing it to me. So
that's a great librarian.
It really has been, a joy. And thank you all for being here. My book came out the first week in January, and I've been in 6 or 7 cities. My plan was that my book tour was going to be only in warm cities. So I was in Phoenix and I was in Orlando, but somehow I ended up also in Ohio, where it was -2 degrees. And yesterday I was in Toronto, where it was similar. So you will forgive my voice.
I wasn't planning this, but I feel moved to just say briefly how we know each other. Because as I just reminded you, I've been there for every single one of your books, all the way back to the one you wrote right after you graduated from college. When I was a teenager, I knew exactly who Janice Kaplan was because I was reading her work in all of my favorite magazines like Glamour and Mademoiselle and 17. And I wrote her a fan letter. And she was at Yale, and I wanted to go to Yale. I made a bet with my mother about how long it would take for me to mention the fact that I didn't get into Yale. I guess it didn't take too long, right? Okay, maybe a minute. But Janice really was my idol, and she also had all of these great internships and fellowships that I also wanted very much to have, and some of which I did eventually get. But I was in her wake, and very grateful to be in her wake. And if I had thought for a minute that I would one day be interviewing you, I really wouldn't have believed it.
Oh,
No, I wouldn't have believed it. It would have been
now,
just
of course,
beyond.
Jean is a huge star
Beyond
now, so.
my ability to imagine. I've read every single one of your books, and they say I jump genres, but you, everything from that first book, Women in Sports, to young adult novels, to very commercial, successful, splashy, fun novels with titles like Mine Are Spectacular, yes, and the Botox Diaries. And then, this very kind of mature series of meditations on, some of the big issues that we all grapple with. And, it's almost as if you are working through these ideas for your own sake, but you're bringing us all along with you. So through gratitude, through luck, through happiness, and the physical side of happiness, which is what this book is about. Did you set out to do that, or is that just kind of like where you found yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I have a short attention span, so I think that's why I've written so many different kinds of books. But after I left as the editor of Parade, for the last 10 years, I've only written nonfiction. And it's been on this kind of topics. And the Gratitude Diaries was a really important book to me, not just because it was a very popular book and continues to be, but because people would be affected by it. And I admit that Gratitude Diaries started out as a little bit of a literary device, like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to spend a year living more gratefully, and then I'll write about it. And because I've always been a journalist, I wasn't just going to write about it. I interviewed people and did lots of research. And as you said, I try to bring people along with me. So I don't just quote research. I'll call the doctor or the psychologist or the neurologist or the Nobel Prize winner. And usually people are surprisingly nice and will talk to you. And then I write about the conversation so that you can kind of be there along and learning it with me. And the Gratitude Diaries wasn't just a literary device after a while. It really started having an effect on me.
You started to believe it.
I started to believe my own Kool-Aid, yes. And I started to discover that you really can do things to make yourself happier. You really can change your perspective. And how that led to this book was the Gratitude Diaries was really about using your brain to change your perspective, to reframe situations, to think about things in a different way. And then, as you'll see in the start of the book, I talk about being on a vacation one day, and when everything was going wrong. Now, nobody's going to have any sympathy for me. I was going to the Caribbean, okay? My luggage got lost, et cetera, and I was doing all these little gratitude games to try to keep myself happy and cheerful. And then I got on, as I said, no sympathy for me. I got on a boat to go to the island we were going to, and all of a sudden, I felt happy. And all of a sudden, the sun was shining, the water was sparkling. I didn't have to do any of my little gratitude games. And I thought, what just happened? And I realized that we are all often in situations like that, where you feel joy or you feel a moment of happiness, and you think, what just happened? And the truth is that our bodies are constantly sending those signals. And, I shouldn't say this to a group of Yaleys, but your brain isn't everything. And, you all have marvelous brains, I have no doubt, but your brain is basically a 3-pound blob sitting inside a very dark skull. And the only information it's getting is from what you send it. And the information that it's getting from your environment, from your body, from what you touch, feel, smell, from your senses. And your brain is just kind of an interpretation machine. It's getting all this information and figuring out what to do next.
Who was it in your book who said that the brain was only this thing that gets carried around by his body?
Yeah, I think that's a line from the comedian John Mulaney, who
Oh,
said
right.
he can't understand what his body is for other than to carry around his head. And, I think it's how we feel a lot. We're all very brain-centric. And, and it's hard to understand how powerful our bodies are. And so, I talk in the book about, goes back 100 years to William James, the, psychologist, philosopher, brother of Henry James. And he talked about if you're walking down a street, if you're walking in the woods, he was saying, and you come to a bear. I live in New York. If you're walking down a street and you come to a dark alley, it's like a bear, and you get scared, right? Your heart starts pounding, your hands are sweating, and you're scared. And his question was, is your heart pounding because you're scared? Or are you scared because your heart is pounding?
Right.
Now, all of us brain-centric people would go, not so hard, Mr. James. Obviously, I'm scared, and that makes my heart pound. But most of the research now suggests that it actually works the opposite way, that your body responds first. And your brain, which is constantly scanning, goes, oh, heart pounding, hands sweating, I think we're scared. Happens a little faster than that, I admit. And it's kind of hard to accept that. But we understand it in more basic ways. Like if you touch a stove, you know you're going to pull your hand back long before your brain can register it. If your brain had to tell your eyes to blink 9,000 times a day, that wouldn't work so well. And what would happen at night to your breathing? So we understand that our bodies have certain things that they do on their own, but I think their power to act, to make us feel certain ways, is much stronger than we realize.
Yeah. So did you form a thesis first when you started to conceive this book? What was the question you were going to solve?
I really was trying to figure out the mind-body connection because, like everybody else, I'm very brain-centric. I'm a writer. I spend all my time in my own head. And I was starting to be curious about some of these connections. And, excuse me, one of the first research studies that I came across that got me intrigued to continue the subject was by a professor at Yale named John Bargh. And he's a tenured professor. He's been in the psychology department forever, and he's done fascinating studies going back many years. And in one of his studies, he invited people to his lab. And as they were coming up in the elevator, he had one of his assistants who was holding all these papers, and then she was holding either a cup of coffee, and she said, "Could you hold this for me for a minute?" And to some people, she gave a warm cup of coffee to hold, and to some people, she gave an iced cup of coffee to hold. Nothing was said about it. And then they got up to the lab where the experiment was for them to meet certain people and describe them and how they felt about them, how warm and kind they thought these people were. And the people who had been given the hot coffee to hold described the people as warmer and kinder than the people who had been given the iced coffee to hold. Now, this kind of blew me away. And I spent a couple of hours doing a Zoom call with John Bargh, who was amazing. And he talked about how our bodies think in metaphors. And this research has been repeated over and over. There's obviously a problem so often in psychological research and in all sorts of social science research and replicability. This has been done in all sorts of different ways. His lab did another study with resumes. Now, that's a kind of standard psychological study. All right, if I gave you a resume and asked you to analyze it, you'd go, "Oh, she's checking for unconscious bias. I'm not going to get, waylaid by the person's name or their ethnicity." What you might not think about would be the weight of the clipboard that was holding the resume. And it turned out that the people who were given resumes on heavy clipboards judged the people as being much more serious, heavyweights, than the people who were given them on light clipboards. And again, if you ask them, did the weight of the clipboard have anything to do with how you felt about them, they would say, "Of course not, that's ridiculous." But it does. Our bodies are sending the information. Our brain is getting the information of a heavyweight or a lightweight. Mm-hmm. One other experiment, if I may, on that got me interested. It was somebody who had been at Barge's lab and then went on to the University of Michigan where he was a business professor, and he was doing research in negotiations. And he found that when people were sitting on hard chairs, they negotiated harder than when they were sitting on soft chairs. Now again, maybe it's the metaphor of soft chair, soft heart, or maybe it's if you're sitting on a hard chair, your body is getting a signal of edginess and hardness, and somehow your brain registers that, and it was a negotiation for a car, and so you fight a little bit harder and negotiate a little bit harder.
Wow. So at the very least, it's more complicated than the fight or flight as we would ordinarily understand it. There's information going back and forth in both directions, and you kind of want both, and you want them to work together for the kind of ultimate optimal experience. When you started your research, are you the kind of writer, I should know this about you, even if I did, I'd pretend I didn't for the sake of this conversation. In fact, I don't know. Are you the kind of writer who does the research and fills up that last file and only then sits down to write, or are you writing throughout?
I write and research at the same time because it usually leads one thing to another. Mm-hmm. So, I did the Bargh research first, and that's one of the first chapters in the book. Mm-hmm. And then as I'm starting to think about other things, I find the people who are connected to that, and I continue on.
Have you ever had the experience where a later interview or opinion negates something that came before, and then you have to decide which am I going with?
That's interesting. I've not had it negate anything. No, I don't think so. But
Maybe next time. There's a lot in this book about movement, physical movement, and creativity that I thought was so interesting. I mean, I had to laugh when I read that, some of your best ideas have come when you're walking or swimming. For me, some of my best ideas come after I've been asleep and then I wake up.
Yeah.
Totally, the opposite of movement. I don't know what that says about me. Maybe that's the difference between fiction and nonfiction. Who knows? But when I read that, I just laughed because I can totally see you doing your laps in the Yale pool, correct?
Yes,
yeah.
I do.
And coming up with brilliant ideas to extend the research you're doing. But it's not just extreme exercise. It's things like knitting, cooking, building Legos, even doodling. So you outed yourself as a doodler. Can you talk about what you learned about your doodling?
Well, those are all different subjects, but yes, doodling was an interesting one for me because I do find myself when I'm on a phone call or when I'm at a conference, and I am the worst. I don't draw. I'm a terrible artist. I don't draw at all, but I make lovely geometric patterns with a pen, and I do that incessantly when I'm on the phone or when I'm at a conference. And I always thought doodling is because you're bored, right? And this is a distraction. And then I came across the research that said it's actually the opposite, that doodling allows you to concentrate better, that we need physical movement. And sitting very still does not allow us to be creative and does not allow us to think that well. And when you're doodling, it's an outlet. And there was actually the research, I believe was done on telephone calls, that people were given certain telephone calls. Some people were doodling, some were not. They were asked to listen to the phone messages. And the people who were doodling remembered them better because there's something about movement that actually allows you to focus. We're not meant to just sit still. You mentioned creativity. And there was a great study that was done out of Stanford. We're allowed to mention Stanford. And it was on creativity. And people were asked, I believe in this research, to come up with as many different creative uses as they could for a key, which again is kind of a standard psychological test. Now, if you said you used it to turn on your car, no points, not creative. If you said you used it to carve the name of your killer in the sand when you've been murdered, full points. I came up with I could clean the bottom of my sneakers. But when they had people do creativity exercises like that, they had them do it sitting, and then they had them doing it when they were walking around. And people came up with more than twice as many uses for a key when they were walking around. And there seems to be something about movement, that the fluidity of your body leads to the fluidity of your mind. And you know that most of the time, if you're working, if you're studying, if you're in a problem, what do? You hunch over more and more, right? You lean over your laptop. I'm not going to get up until I figure this out. And it's probably the worst thing you can do. Get up, walk around. When you mention some of those other things like knitting or playing Legos, some of it is what psychologists refer to as soft fascination. And it's the same thing as a fireplace or water or being in the shower. It's enough to keep you interested. It's enough to keep your brain aware of something interesting going on, but it's not enough to completely distract you. Now, if I were knitting, it would distract me because I don't know how to knit. But for people who are knitting and can just do it while they're, not doing anything else, or if you're out, if you're taking a shower, one reason you get ideas in the shower is because there is that soft fascination that interests your brain but doesn't distract it, and that allows you to come up with more ideas.
So where does waking up with a solution to a thorny problem in your novel after 6 hours of sleep fit into this theory?
I have no idea, but I have to admit, Gina, I do the same thing. I will wake up in the middle of the night and I will write an entire article in the dark, and I'll look at it in the morning and I'll think, oh, that's going to be a disaster, and I'll go no, actually, it's pretty good. I think I'll stick with that. I don't know the answer to that, but that's a subject for my next book.
Yeah,
there we go.
I really want that answered. The one thing that I wouldn't have ordinarily thought of as movement, which you do write about, is smiling as a kind of movement that that has the capacity to change your mood, just like in the old Nat King Cole song. Smile though your heart is breaking, and you feel better.
Right.
I'm paraphrasing Nat King Cole, sorry, but what is that?
So there are a couple of things. First, by the way, everybody here, please sit up a little bit straighter.
Oh.
Just sit up a little bit straighter in your chair, thank you. Because there's research that when you sit straight or when you stand up straight, you have better access to positive emotions. And it may be that when we're depressed or down, we naturally slouch, and our brains start to associate slouching with negativity. And so again, back to our scanning brains going like, oh, slouching, not so happy, sitting up straight, happy. And it's amazing how well it works. You can try, I talk about it in the book, a psychologist who walked me through this experiment of slouching over. He asked me to think of a negative emotion and a positive emotion. And when you are slouched, negative thoughts come to your mind really easily. When you're sitting up straight, positive thoughts do. Mm-hmm. It's very similar with, well, smiling is similar, but slightly different. And that goes back to an experiment that was done many years ago by a psychologist named Fritz Stracher. He was the first one who did it. I think it's been repeated in 128 labs across the country, across the world, smiling experiments. He had people put a wooden pencil in their mouth. And in some cases, the pencil was to push their face into a smile. And in some cases, it was to push their face into a frown. And it turned out that the people who were smiling were happier and found things funnier than the people whose faces were contorted into a frown. Mm-hmm. And you would think that these great brains that we were talking about before are smart enough to know the difference between a smile and a pencil in your mouth, but it turns out they're really not. There's something called the facial feedback hypothesis, which says that the muscles in our face are sending information to our brains, and our brains are taking that information to determine emotion. Now, the flip side of this may be Botox. And there's some early research suggesting that if you get Botox and you can't frown, it's harder to be negative. So I have now given anybody who would like to get Botox a reason that has nothing to do with vanity. You are simply doing this to make yourself happier.
Yeah, that is really food for thought. Yeah. Well, okay. And to put it even more interestingly, you cite the, I believe, classic case of the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Mrs. Maisel goes out to do her set, and her manager, coach, always says to her,
do I have to say it? Tits up.
Tits
so,
up.
Yes, and that's the idea of standing up.
Yeah.
Of standing
Tits
up straight, you feel more positive, and you're ready to face things.
So Susie, the manager, had read the study.
Clearly, absolutely, yeah.
Or maybe, what's their name, the couple who created the series, maybe they read the study.
But I will say that I actually use that, the standing straight, not the tits up necessarily, but sometimes when you're walking in New York and it's cold and you slip and a bus decides to come by and splash you with water and you're going, why am I living here? This is so miserable. And it used to be that when I wrote the Gratitude Diaries, I would sometimes make myself physically stop and think, all right, you're the gratitude lady. Think of something positive. You're not moving until you come up with something positive right now to think about. And it's surprising how much it helps. It really, just like that little moment, actually changes your attitude, and you're able to move on better. Now I have another little trick in the arsenal, which is that when I'm feeling that way, I usually find out that I'm like this, and I'll stand up, I'll take a moment and stand up straight, and I'll give a fake smile, and I'll look up, and I'll sort of, look at the sky, and that gives you a little help also.
I'm very upset that I'm going to have to share this this element of your book with my mother, who's been telling me to sit up straight for more than 60 years. And I do remember we had posture bands at camp. It was like a prize. They would surprise you with the people they had noticed sitting up straight during the week. So I guess they knew what they're doing. Oh, so there's a lot in the book about food, which is always interesting. I mean, we all eat food, and some of us think about food probably more than we should. So, you know, the ways in which our brains interfere is really, I think, the right word, with just the pure pleasure of eating food are myriad, and we're not going to hit them all, but I wonder if you could talk about, one of the researchers you spoke with was Charles Spence at Oxford, and he had an interesting theory about how our brains kind of have a way of overriding what we smell and kind of processing the information and then feeding it back into the experience. This is longhand for the headline here, which is that wine always tastes better in Paris. So why should the same wine taste so much better in Paris and so bad when you bring the bottle home because it tasted so good in Paris?
Well, Charles Spence was one of those really fun people to talk to. He does a multi-sensory experiments. He has his own lab at Oxford, and he's one of the people who has found that, you know, we think we taste with our mouths and maybe our noses. We understand that part of it, but he discovered that our senses are all constantly interacting. And I can tell you the Paris story from my perspective was I was in Paris with my husband, and I don't drink very much. I drink hardly at all. But we were at a lovely cafe. We got a bottle of wine. We were drinking it, and I said, "This wine is amazing. This wine is just great." And so he's a nice man, and we went back home, and he went to our local wine dealer, and he had taken a picture of it, and he asked him. The guy found the bottle for him, and he handed him the bottle. And he looked at him and he said, "But I got to tell you, it's not going to drink like it did in Paris." and of course he was right, because in Paris I wasn't just drinking the wine. I was drinking in Paris. I was drinking in the atmosphere. I was drinking in the cafe. I was happy. And you confuse all of those things together. Charles Spence has done so many interesting studies on things like finding that the color of the plate you eat from influences you. I think he was the one who found that when you eat a dessert from a white plate, you think it tastes sweeter than when it's on a black plate. If you're trying to impress people at a cocktail party, you don't have to buy really expensive cheese. Just get a very angular cheese plate, because when cheese is on an angular plate, people think it tastes sharper and is a more expensive cheese. So there are all sorts of things like that.
So we literally see sharp angle, and it communicates sharp to us.
And I think he was the one who also did the experiment with the whiskey, where he set up 3 different rooms that were completely different, with different music, lighting, atmospheres, and he gave people a glass of whiskey, and they would go to the first room, and then at the end they would have a little questionnaire about how the whiskey tasted, and then they would go to the second room, same thing. And the people who were in the room that was with green lights and that had very bucolic atmosphere described the whiskey as being sort of grassy and, you know, fresh. And then they'd go to the next room that was jazzy, and they would describe it as being a little brassy. Now, the funny story was they were holding the same glass the whole time. And
they knew it was the same whiskey.
They knew it was the same whiskey. And he said at the end, they realized nobody had fooled them. They had fooled themselves.
Right. Oh, God, that's so interesting. Was that in the book?
Yeah.
I missed that. So I was too busy focusing on
the wine in Paris.
No, the chocolate mousse part.
The chocolate mousse.
I was very interested in the chocolate mousse.
I was really interested in the chocolate mousse, too. Yeah. And I will tell you, well, all right, so let me explain about the chocolate mousse, which is that our brains like things in a status quo. They like things to be the same. And then they don't have to pay a lot of attention. And as soon as something is different, you know, you hear a horn outside, the horn distracted you. And that's as it should be, because when things are the same, you don't have to pay attention. When there's a noise, when there's a distraction, when there's something different, your brain perks up and goes, "Is everything okay?" And your body perks up. Well, it's the same thing with food. So his explanation, and I can't remember if it was Spence or Pierre Chandon who did this experiment, where he he said that the first taste of a food is the best. It's the most exciting. So you get a chocolate mousse and you take that first taste, it's a 10. It's always a 10. Take the second taste, still good, maybe it's a 9. Third taste, your brain's getting a little used to it. It's not quite as excited, you're down to an 8. Keep eating, by the time you're at the bottom of the bowl, you're at a 1 or a 2. You're not really paying attention, your brain's not so interested, you're just kind of dutifully eating. His point is that your sum total of pleasure in that mousse is not the total of those numbers, but the average of them. So if you stop while you're still at a 9 or a 10 or an 8, you're going to have so much more pleasure than if you eat to the bottom of the bowl. Now, I have a friend in Los Angeles who emailed me the other day, and he said, I'm loving your book, but I have a little disagreement, and I just ate an entire box of chocolate, and I liked every bit of it.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting, and I've been trying it, and it's when you think of it that way, when you think of eating for happiness, and you think of just eating a couple of bites of something, a lot of times when you're at a restaurant, you get a dessert, you really just want a taste of something.
Yeah.
You're not really looking for the whole thing, but you're going like, oh, it's here, I'll eat it.
I paid for it.
I paid for it. Sunk cost, it's gone. And if you just take like 2 or 3 bites, you can be really happy with it. Something that goes along with this is that, the really expensive tasting menus in New York? I think the chefs are getting away with murder, because I think what's happening is that they're putting out a little tiny taste of something, and you taste it, and your brain goes, oh, that's great, love that, and they whisk it away and give you something else before you can go like, maybe it wasn't so good. I'm not sure I like the pistachio in that. But it is an interesting way to eat, that you do have much more pleasure by eating lots of small things.
Oh, you're making me feel so much better about that time that I had my very first panic attack at the French Laundry. I got 3 courses in and I had to leave. And I don't think I'll ever be allowed back to French Laundry. But I think anyone who has ever dieted, which is, all of us, has been taught the dieting version of that, which is that you're only going to enjoy the first 3 bites. So stop after that. But maybe that's just how my twisted brain interpreted it. But I loved reading about the chocolate mousse. And then we moved on to the exercise section of the book, which sort of took me back to Women in Sports, your first book.
Written the year I graduated Yale.
Yeah, and it was, in a way, the through line of inquiry is, you wander far afield, but you come back too, and to me that's a very beautiful thing, because I love following your brain through all the different things that have engaged your very, very impressive brain atop that you're carrying around that body. But one of the things that you mentioned in this section of the book is that the body sabotages weight loss through exercise. If you exercise more, it just kind of tweaks itself and negates your exercise. So thinking of exercise as a way to lose weight is a losing proposition. But when you when you figure out how to brand exercise as pleasurable activity, which you did, swimming here at the Yale Club, without knowing you were doing that, very delightful physical things happen. And I feel like that's something you discovered through research and anecdotally in your own life.
Yeah, I was interested in the question of, we all know exercise is good for us, right? I mean, I don't think anybody has any question about that. But nobody likes to do it. You don't jump. A lot of people, unless some people I'm sure do, but for a lot of people, it's still a chore to go to the gym. And I interviewed a guy named Daniel Lieberman, who is a professor at Harvard. And he's an anthropologist. And he has a fascinating idea, which is that he says that, we always hear our bodies are meant to move. And he said, yeah, they are. But no hunter-gatherer worth his salt would run a marathon, because it's a waste of energy. And basically, our bodies are meant to move to do the things we need to do. And the real goal of your body is to preserve energy. And so when you wake up in the morning and, you know, there's the angel and the devil on your shoulders telling you, go to the gym, don't go to the gym, it's really your mind and body. Because your mind has read all the stuff and says, like, exercise is good for you, let's go to the gym. And your body is going, preserve energy, stay in bed. And I found that a really, excuse me, a really interesting way to think about it. The other thing is that exercise works much better, I think, when we think of it, just like if you think of food as a happiness rather than like, what should I eat? It's a better way to eat. If you think of exercise as a happiness, it's a better way to move. And yeah, I enjoy going to the pool, and I'm really slow, but I make sure I'm there when nobody else is there, and it's just a pleasure. And I think, you know, I suggest in the book, and there's actually a researcher who did the studies on Apple Watches and GPS watches. And if you're an athlete and you're, you know, aiming for the Olympics, absolutely test every day, you know, how fast you're going, how much more you're doing. If you're looking to just be happy, throw the darn Apple Watch away. Because you don't need to take 10,000 steps. And it doesn't matter how much faster you're going today than you went yesterday. Go outside, take a walk, enjoy nature, enjoy the pleasure of being outside. And that's going to be much more satisfying and ultimately much more healthful than anything else.
Yeah, I love that you did this deep dive on the validity of the 10,000 steps theory. And your husband was one of the very few people I've ever encountered who said, this is bull. This is bull. Bulldog. This is bulldog.
I think most people know by now that 10,000 steps was created by a Japanese pedometer company. And it has no scientific evidence whatsoever. And 10,000 means, has a meaning in Japanese that was, I forget what it is, but it was something that made sense on their machines. And so somehow we have all adopted that. And
I still feel guilty if I don't do 10,000 steps a day. So, I think we'll go to some questions, maybe? Is that a good idea? Okay, let me just ask a couple more things. Part of this inquiry into exercise and happiness led you, of course, to the question of exercise and depression. And you mentioned a study in which one group of depressed people was given medication, one was given, told to exercise, and one was given both or neither, I can't remember. But you know, quickest out of the gate was the medication group. They got the lift first. But after 16 weeks, there was no difference between the medication and the exercise group. And after 10 months, the exercise group was actually ahead of the medication group. So, you know, it may not be a weight loss strategy, but it is a happiness strategy.
And you know, it's interesting. I have a whole section on placebos in the book, and we tend to be embarrassed by the idea of placebos, like, oh, I've tricked myself into something. And actually, we should celebrate placebos. Because what placebos mean is your body is taking care of itself, and that you have the power to make yourself feel better. And you know, the placebo effect is very, very powerful. And we won't get into it now, but I do have a chapter talking about that, and understanding that and understanding the effects of pain, I think, were really interesting to me.
All right, well, does anybody in the audience have a question for Janice?
Just as someone who's a slave to her Fitbit, I love hearing this. You tear a tendon in your foot and you're like, how am I going to do those 10,000 steps? Thank you.
Yeah. 10,000 steps today.
May I say that my family all has GPS watches, and they're on Strava, whatever that is, and they are constantly, and so they have paid no attention to me whatsoever. But,
Does anyone have a question?
That's as it should be.
This is all fascinating. Thank you. It's wonderful. About 1981, I switched from a typewriter to a computer. And I'm trying to think right now about your talking about this. Is there any evidence people got happier either way?
I don't know of any. It's a great question. I'm not sure it would really make that much of a difference. I mean, it's basically the same motion. Maybe you're doing a little bit more with the typewriter, but I think that's more just a question of habit. What do you think?
Well, I could never have become a writer without the advent of the keyboard. I'm a terrible handwriter, and my writing can't keep up with my thoughts. So none of it would have happened without the keyboard, but I found no difference at all between going from the IBM Selectric, the greatest typewriter ever invented, and all of the keyboards that I've used since then.
I will say that the feel of something makes a big difference. And if I can tell a little side story about that, I think I tell the story in the book. I got an iPhone at one point, and I got a new iPhone. And I went home and I used it for a week, and I just didn't like it. I thought, I didn't like anything about it. And I went back to the store and I said, this is a terrible iPhone. My previous one was better. I want my old phone back. And the genius at the Genius Bar really was. And he said, you know what, I think the problem is the case that you got. And I said, the case? And he said, yeah, I'm finding that people who got that case aren't happy with the phone. And it was a plastic, it was just, I got the cheapest one. It was, like a hard-edged plastic case. And he said, just try this silicone one instead. Try the soft case instead. So I did, and I thought, all right. And I went home, and I was using the phone, and I thought, like, wow, the camera on this phone is really good. and wow, I love the way that app works. And, and it took me a while to realize that it was the same phone that I had hated the day before. And it was indeed the fact of how it felt in my hand.
Oh my gosh.
That when it felt so, that with that case, it felt so clumsy in my hand that all I could feel was clumsiness and things not working. And my brain was just going like, clumsy, uncomfortable. And as soon as I had the normal soft silicone case, which wasn't that expensive, the phone was great.
Wow, was it the same color and everything?
No, I think it was whatever. But
it might have been the color.
But it might have been the color, and it might have been the feel. But I think those are the things that you don't think of, and I think those are the things that maybe changed also when you went from typewriter to computer, that there was a different feel on your fingers, that you were getting different messages to your brain.
Well, I mentioned I was going to say, I'm glad you mentioned the color. I mentioned the color. I was very excited to learn that blue and green are the happiest colors because they're my favorite colors. I don't think of myself as that happy all the time. But why are blue and green the happiest colors?
Well, it's really about what they stand for. That green is about being outdoors and being in nature, and blue is about being near water. And there's really good research about the power of being outdoors. The worst named piece of research in the book was something called the Mappiness Project, which is a combination of maps and happiness. And it was researchers in the UK who were using geolocation to find where people were and then buzzing them to ask them about their happiness and their well-being. And they found that the greatest connection they could find was being out in nature. Just made people happier, no matter where it was, no matter what else they were doing, no matter what else was going on in their lives. Green spaces, being out in nature. And other research has found that blue spaces, water, 2 hours a week near water seems to improve well-being almost more than anything else. And it doesn't have to be an ocean. You can go to a lake, a stream, the Hudson River, the East River, take a walk. This city has done an actually great job in reclaiming the waterfronts. And at first I thought, like, this is so expensive. They built near where I live. They built like a 5-block addition to the walkway on the east side over the East River at the cost of like $200 million. And I just thought, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And now I think it's one of the smartest things I've ever heard, because water is important, and being near water is really crucial to us.
Well, you make me feel happy that I moved down to South Street.
That's
Seaport,
right.
where I see the water every day.
Okay, another question.
I was wondering to what extent you looked at individual variations. You talk about people as if everyone was the same. For example, you mentioned water. I mean, I find, to me, nothing could be worse than having to spend 8 hours at the beach. I'd be bored out of my mind and go crazy. But some people that love the beach. More broadly, I love sports, but I don't like exercise, and like I can't think anything. I mean, swimming has got to be the most tedious, and besides being work, it's also like I'm the kind of person that if they have nothing to think about, just worries. Versus I want to be distracted. So I want an activity that distracts me, and I'm happier when I'm distracted. So I'm wondering to what extent you've looked at individual variations in the kind of studies you looked at.
No, it's a great question, and obviously people are different, and the generality of water making you happy does not suggest that you should spend 8 hours at a beach by any means. You could, but spending 20 minutes, taking a little walk by the East River might make you happy, right? Yes, there is variation in how people approach things, but I think the messages I think the bigger message is that understanding the links between our bodies and brains is really important, and we often overlook it, and we don't think of our own happiness, our own experiences in that way. And if something's making you miserable, don't do it. Absolutely. I remember, many years ago, my mother had shoulder pain, and the doctor told her to put ice on it. And she said, "Oh, but it usually feels better when I put heat on it." And he said, "Then put heat on it." There aren't absolute answers to anything, including in medicine. So I think part of what you're saying is understand what brings you pleasure and understand how your body-brain connections are working, and that is important.
Have you come across any research on the "it could be worse" tactic?
He asked about research on the "it could be worse" tactic. I think that's part of what I started out with in the gratitude idea of reframing a situation. And, when I wrote the Gratitude Diaries, for me, I often say, look, I have a good life. I'd never pretend otherwise. And for me, it was about going from good to better. And, but when I tour, when I give talks on that book, people would come up to me and tell me these completely terrible situations that they'd had in their lives, suicides, deaths, family issues, whatever, cancers in young people, and they would tell me how gratitude had helped them through. And I found that so powerful and moving because, it's always really easy to look at the people who have more, and the "it could be worse" actually is a way of saying, appreciate what I have right now and change the things you can change. If there's anything you can change, go out and change it. But when you're in a situation and you can't, try to find things that are good in it. Try to find the things that you can appreciate in it.
Okay, we have a question.
Hi, I'm curious across all these studies how happiness was measured and if there was variance across these studies and what you found interesting.
Despite the title of my book, I don't really talk about happiness in the book so much as well-being. And I think that's the phrase that psychologists are using more now, because what we're really talking about is improving your general feeling, right? Your general well-being, the approach that you have to the world, and the positivity that you experience. So I think that's probably a good way to look at it. It's a good question about how it's measured, and obviously it's very subjective, right? There's no happiness meter that rings. There is no blood test for happiness, so I think it becomes how you describe your own situation.
Like the infamous pain chart that the Sacklers gave us. Speaking of opioids, I just wanted to, you made this point that I felt was very interesting about how, the most dangerously addictive drugs, including opioids, are simply imitations of what our bodies can naturally provide. So we're not talking about, small things here. I mean, if our bodies have the potential to really give us, I mean, I've never used an opioid before, but to give us that kind of jolt of well-being and pleasure, then, this is a major impact.
And somebody mentioned, I think we mentioned depression before, and The research is pretty clear that antidepressant drugs are about 82% a placebo. Now, 18% is not a placebo. And for some people, that 18% makes a huge difference. But 82% is a big deal. And I don't think most people who are on antidepressants have the conversation with their doctor that, please understand that 82% of what's making you feel better is really your own body and has nothing to do with the drug you're taking. And realizing, as you just said, the power of our bodies to change how we feel, to do so many of the same things that drugs do, is pretty powerful.
Yeah, I would say so.
All right, one more question, and then we'll let Janice sign some books. Okay.
Hello, thank you. You spoke a bit about the experiment with the whiskey and going into different rooms. I'm curious if you came across any research about designing spaces that increased feelings of well-being or increased feelings of depression within one's own self.
It's a great question, and yes, I have a whole chapter about that. And design is very powerful in how we feel. And I'm not going to remember specifically what they are now, but things like high ceilings, sunlight. There are many things that make us feel happier, and you sense it. You know, when you walk into a room, sometimes when you walk into an art gallery, often, you know, that has those high ceilings and bright colors of paintings and light coming in. There's an elation that brings. I talk in the book about the power of place and the power of cathedrals. You know, you don't have to be religious to go into any church in Europe and go like, I believe. I mean, it just works. You know, there's the power of that architecture to do that. So yes, I think it's really important. Design is really important, and our environments and the spaces that we create for ourselves at home also make a big difference.
Janice, thank you so much for being here. And Jean. So for the last, I don't know, couple of months, I've been getting Janice's Substack, which is Janice.Kaplan. What's the Substack address?
Yeah, it's just janice.kaplan@substack.com.
And these come into my inbox, and you know, normally you'd be like, oh, I don't have time to read this. And every time I read it, I'm like, oh, stand up straighter. That'll make you happy. And you're slumping in the elevator on the way up to the 7th floor, and you're like, okay, no, stand up. They've just been such a joy to get, so thank you for
They're
that.
free also, so
Yeah,
sign up.
and it's
completely
just,
free.
it
There will
really
not be a paywall.
It makes you think differently about how you're approaching your day. And I have to say, when I was crazed from September to December doing activities for the club, they'd come into my inbox and I'd be like, okay, I hate the world right now, but this is helpful.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. So we do have copies of the book at the back. I know some of you bought them. I'm going to have Janice kind of head back there. She can sign things for you. And I just want to thank you both again for being here. Happiness is really important, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you don't have Jean's books, they're not here, but definitely buy The Plot and the sequel.
And we have them here in the library.
Brilliant books.
Thank you.